Okay, we're on record now, and this will be uploaded tomorrow. You
Okay.
you'll miss the first few slides, uh, but they're not really that important. But if you want me to, I'll go back over them.
No, that's all right. Continue on.
Okay. Well, since you're there, I'm going to give you the full thing. If you'd go, uh, let me see. I just talked about organizational behavior. This is kind of a lead in. One of the reasons we
Okay.
study organizational behavior, at least as far as I'm concerned, is we spend about a third of our day at the workplace. And so we need to figure out how people behave, how they act, how they think in different settings and situations. And so that's why it's important we study organizational behavior. This is an interdisciplinary field, as the text says. It's grounded in psychology, sociology, anthropology, and economics. And so there's a number of different social type sciences that impact on organizational behavior. And then if you will look on page 6 of your textbook,
Mhm.
it talks about the various types of ways we can study organization. This is following what's known as the scientific model and scientific methods models. And there are various ones that you see in there. We do scientific methods in following organizational behavior because scientific methods are the scientific method itself is based upon fact. And so the studies that we go through are usually empirical studies based on fact, and we try to replicate those. And you'll see on that page we have field studies, laboratory studies, case studies, pardon me, survey studies, and meta-analyses. We will use case studies in this text and in this course. And one of the things that you should remember is that a case study is specific to the organization which it studies, or a particular case if it's not about an organization. And many times the what goes on in that particular case study is not generalizable to the to other organizations. You may have some that are kind of similar, but ordinarily it's not generalizable. But as the next slide, which you can't see, unfortunately, I apologize for that, uh, ask the question is what technique can be generalized across multiple settings? Case studies, which we said cannot be. Field studies, which are normally done kind of like a case study, but they're a little bit different. And the other one is the meta-analyses. Now, the response to that question is meta-analyses because, as you read in the textbook, uses statistical pooling and results from different empirical studies, and that can be an aggregate. And that aggregating technique allows you to generalize and then apply particular conclusions that have been reached across a variety of uh, organizational behavior situations. Then I talked about contingency thinking, and I'm not sure when you got in. Contingency thinking is just saying that we really need to look at events that may happen and then develop particular strategies to address what happens. So if you want to think about this as alternative ways of thinking or having an alternative policy or an alternative course of action, that's right because that's exactly what that is. It just really simply means that we don't have a one size fits all situation. The next slide that I'm going to go to is evidence-based management. And again, this is kind of backing up what we've already talked about. We're talking about using hard facts and empirical evidence. Uh, and this helps us through this contingency approach. We have different situations and then how we're going to handle them. The next slide that I have, pardon me, is just and by the way, these slides are embedded in the course itself. So if you wanted to, you could access the course I think you can do that while you're on the telephone. This is in week 1, and this go through each of the slides as I go through them. And I apologize for the technology glitch. I'll have to get that fixed. But anyway, this talks about modern workplace trends. There's a commitment to, and I'm not going to go through all these, a commitment to ethics. And I don't think ethical behavior, and I don't think we need to talk a whole lot about that, simply because in the last 14, 15 years, we have had a series of disasters in the business world. Bernie Madoff maybe being the most famous and most recent, but certainly we've had Enron and we've had Adelphia, we've had WorldCom, all coming to fruition because of poor ethical choices and poor ethical leadership. We're finding today a demise of command and control in organizations as they become flatter and more nimble. We know we have more technology use. We have a concern for sustainability. We're talking here about the environment and things of that nature. And then there's a greater emphasis, although sometimes I wonder whether this is true today. It's supposed to be a greater emphasis on human capital and teamwork. I think there is a greater emphasis on teamwork today, but I sometimes challenge the thought process, pardon me, that we have a greater emphasis on human capital, meaning we're paying more attention to our employees and putting employees first and things of that nature. I too often hear horror stories about how employees are treated. So I'm always concerned with whether that's true. I know from a perspective of theory, that's the way it's supposed to work, but I'm not always so sure that it is. The next slide I'm coming to is slide number 12, if you're trying to keep up. And this is just gives the definition of an organization. And it talks about a collection of people. Let's talk about employees, people who are hired. And they're working together to achieve some type of common purpose or common goal or common objective or objectives. And so we have these people and they are held together by something or some things. And normally we talk about those as being the organization's culture. And culture is a number of different things to a number of different people. It is, as this particular slide says, these are the shared set of beliefs that an organization has, also coupled with their values. And if you go to any organization, you'll find that they all have something that they aspire to, that they want to, and they have a certain type of culture. Now, when we think of culture in this particular aspect, we should not be thinking of a Hispanic culture or an African culture or Native American culture or something of that nature. We're thinking about a culture within an organization, what it stands for, what it means, what it wants to do, how we set ourselves apart from our competitors and from those outside our front gates, if you will. Now, we'll talk about culture a lot as we go through this course, but we'll get into it more when we get to chapter 15. I think there's one thing that bears importance here in this particular slide, and it talks about Meg Whitman, who's the former CEO of eBay and is now the CEO of Hewlett-Packard. And she says that culture is the character of an organization. And that's very important. And many organizations take this culture so importantly, and they place such a value on it that they look for people that they hire who are going to fit their culture. SAS Corporation, which is a technology outfit in North Carolina, does that. And Toyota does that. Toyota does that. I'm sure they do it in Japan as well, but they certainly do it in this country. And this is what is known, at least on the human resource side, as an organizational fit, as opposed to a job fit. And here you're trying to make sure that the person you're going to hire fits in with the organization's culture, as opposed to that person being a fit for a particular job. Now, that does not mean to say that organizations are not paying attention to hiring a person for the job. What it means to say is that this organization is looking for someone, and they're in the interview process, and they find out that this person may not be best suited for the job that he or she has applied for, but they're well suited to work for that organization. They'll try to find that person a position in the organization. So they're trying to keep the organization strong by hiring, for lack of a better term, like-minded people. Following along with organization culture, we have organization climate. And this is simply what the employees believe about the organization. They believe about its formal management, its informal management, its policies and procedures. Now, the slide uses the term shared perceptions. And I like to use the term belief because I think most of us realize that perception is reality. And so that's why I like to use that term. We like to look at organizations, and you should find this in some of your other management courses, as an open system. This simply means that the organization takes resources from outside, brings them inside, and puts them through some sort of transformation process, and then turns out a finished good or product. That is graphically displayed in your textbook, figure 1.2 on page 10. And we see resource inputs on the left-hand side, and then the transformation process on the inside. That's work activities and whatever else happens to be, and then finished product on the other side. And we'll notice that everything that is mentioned here in the resource inputs is not something you can hold in your hand, or you can see, or you can touch, or something else. There's a lot of intangibles there. People are intangibles, even though people, we know what they are and we can see them. I'm talking employees here, I should be more specific. But the intangible part of that is the mental capabilities and capacities that they bring to the organization. And we see other things like information and things of that nature. The next concept, next slide here that I have, talks about a value chain. And a value chain is just simply whatever it is that an organization does that results in creating the goods and services that we just talked about on a previous slide, but making sure that when they come out, that those have some type of tangible, I'm using that term, on the intangible probably is also part of it, but tangible value to the customer who wants that good or service. So what we're actually doing here is not only are we taking an input, transforming that input through our processes into an output, we are also adding value to that output. So it's something that the customer either needs or wants, and they're actually looking for that value. I guess a good example of that would be going to a jeweler and buying a watch. I happen to have a watch that's a Century or Citizens watch. It's a very nice watch. I can't remember what I paid for it. And it does for me what I want it to do. It's utilitarian, it tells time. But if I really wanted a value to that watch, then I would think maybe about buying something like a Rolex or a higher dollar value Citizens watch that is adding something to this above and beyond just telling time. And I just use that as an example. There are many others, and you can probably think of many yourself. The next slide we're talking here about our stakeholders. And I always like to take the time when we're talking about stakeholders to mention that we're not talking about stockholders here. We're talking about anyone who has a stake in the organization. And yes, they can be a stockholder, but they are employees. They are the folks that sell us the goods, our vendors, if you will. They are the people who sell our goods. That first part meant sell goods to us to turn into finished product. The people that sell our goods, the wholesalers or the agents or brokers or whoever they happen to be, or maybe even retailers. We think of government, we think of the local setting, we think of the environment in which we work. All of these things are our stakeholders. This next slide, it actually is really asking a question of you. I'm not really sure why this slide comes where it does. I'll just pose it to you. I don't ask you to answer this. Just ask you to think about the organization that you either work for presently or you did work for. And I wanted to know if the culture was constructive. Was it defensive? Was it aggressive? Think about how that operates and what you would what you would do and how you would answer that, and whether that's made a difference to you in your interactions with the hierarchy, with your peers, or with people who were subordinates, etc. We now come to a term called workforce diversity. And we're going to talk more about diversity in Chapter 2, and we'll talk about diversity other places throughout the course. All diversity here means is that it is people who are somehow different than others. And the difference can be based upon gender, it can be based upon race, ethnicity, age, whether or not the person is able-bodied, sexual orientation. There's a number of other ones. Those are just some that we go through. And we think a lot about that and how that goes on. And again, as I mentioned, we'll talk more about this and the next two topics that we come to in Chapter 2. Multiculturalism is the next one. And that just talks about pluralism as it refers to diversity. And then inclusion, and this is a term that we will explore more in Chapter 2. I believe it's mentioned in the one case study that we work about Xerox in Chapter 2. And that is, this is not just having people there by meaning diversity or multiculturalism. It is how this polyglot, my term, of differences among our workforce that we just spelled out here a moment or two ago is included within the organization, and how the organization not only respects it, but allows, if you will, and that's a term maybe I probably shouldn't use allow, but promotes equal opportunity for all people. And that's not just for promotions and things of that nature. It's for training, it's for all sorts of things. And of course, then their organization has to show some sort of value to way to do that. This is another type thing, and this kind of talks about organizational behavior and how people behave. And this is just a question that's posed here. And it states that the professor that's teaching your course, think of this course or some other course, says that there's going to be a team project. And then you're supposed to select a project and sign up for it. So the question is, do you congregate around your friends and decide to sign up? Do you wait for everybody to sign up and then decide what you want to do? Do you just pick a team randomly? And this has a lot to do with organizational behavior and how people interact with each other. The next slide we come to, pardon me again, talks about a manager. And we think of managers perhaps in different ways. Years ago, we thought of managers as telling the employee what to do. Now, there was a reason for that. And I think most of us either don't know the reason or haven't heard the reason or didn't think about the reason. But one of the reasons that the manager was telling the employees that worked for him, or direct reports, I like to call them, was that he was the only one or she was the only one that got the pertinent information. They were kind of passing that along to people. So managers years ago not only were people that told you what to do and how to do it, and perhaps had some technical expertise, they're the ones that had the information, and they had to pass that information along. So we look at that as a definition of a manager in a way. There's another definition, as the slide says, and it says it is that person's job to directly support the efforts of the people that work for him or her. And then a person who is an effective manager helps his or her employees achieve high levels of performance and satisfaction. There is an old philosophy that task performance leads to job satisfaction, and job satisfaction leads to task performance. We're going to talk more about this as we get later in the course, and we'll try to make those connections a little more concrete than they are today, than they are right now, because we're going to have some specifics that we talk about. But task performance just talks about what an employee does or what an employee is supposed to do. It also should discuss the quality and quantity of his or her output, and then any services that go along with that by him or her, by the team that he or she is assigned to, and to the organization as a whole. I'd like to take this time to say that every person who works for an organization should not only understand his or her job, but should understand how his or her job supports the organization's mission, goals, and objectives. Everybody is a cog, if you will, in a very giant wheel. And you have to know how you fit in and how what you do supports. And I'm talking about all the way from the CEO to the janitor or janitors. It's very important to make sure that's done. Job satisfaction, I don't think we have to say a whole lot about it. That just tells us how well somebody likes his or her job and how good they are at it. The next slide we have talks about the 4 managerial roles, or I think as the textbook points out, functions: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. And you can see this graphically displayed, figure 1.3 on page 12, and it is a circle. This probably shows it being a little bit more elliptical than a circle, but you begin with planning, then you go to organizing, to leading, and to controlling. It's not to say that you don't mix and match where you are at one particular point in time. One of the things I like to stop and talk about is controlling. Too often we think of controlling as about standing over top of somebody and controlling what they do. And controlling here simply means, as the figure in your textbook says, measuring performance. Now it says performance here, measuring output, if you will, and then doing the things that are required to make sure that the output goes through the entire process and is quality in every step of the way. So if you have you're putting something through a manufacturing run, you don't want to get to the end and find out that that particular product doesn't meet specifications. That was the old thing we called years ago quality control. You still hear it used today. I don't like to use the term that way, because quality control in those days meant somebody stood at the end of the production line and took a sample off the production line and said, well, this doesn't meet specifications, so threw it away over in the trash bin. Well, there was no quality control because the product was defective. So this controlling is measuring the manufacturing process, if you will, through all of its steps and making sure that everything is within tolerance as it goes through there, as opposed to waiting to the end to find out if we have a defective product. The next slide, which you can also see in your text, the figure 1.4, comes from a very famous management guru, Henry Mintzberg, who is, if he's not a Canadian, he certainly teaches in Canada. And this just talks about the various roles that managers have. That he uses the term effective managers have. And I'm not going to go through these for you because you can read them for yourself, and they're fairly self-explanatory. And we need to think about managers need to do this. Managers need to have these roles, and they need to understand these roles if they expect to be effective and be able to effectively lead those that work for them, etc. And then here we come to the next, which kind of follows along, is managerial skills and competencies. A skill is something that an individual has, possesses, if you will. Sometimes it's innate, sometimes it's learned, and he or she has the ability to translate this knowledge, if you will, the skill knowledge, into action. And a slide says the desired performance. Well, okay, we would hope that the action you would do would be a desired performance. Then following along with these roles, we find that managers have to have three types of skills. They have to have technical skills, human skills. The human skills that really talks about human relations, and conceptual skills. We find that where you are on the managerial spectrum, you need more or less of each of these three. If you're down where the rubber meets the road, and you're the first line supervisor, you have to have a high degree of technical skills. As you move up that managerial line into middle management, of course, that's a vanishing thing today, move into middle management, you need to still retain those technical skills, but you probably don't need as many of those as you need ability to get along skills, human relations skills. And then when you move up to senior management, you need to have conceptual skills, ability to analyze and solve complex problems. We now talk about emotional intelligence. And there's a couple of things here in emotional intelligence that I want to talk about. It talks about self-awareness, and that's just knowing yourself. It is knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. Obviously, capitalizing on your strengths and doing the things that you need to do to improve your weaknesses. Being able to control yourself. The slide here says self-regulation, but that's the same type of thing. Obviously, to be motivated, be able to empathize with your fellow workers, and then to have this social skill set, which means that you're able to get along. We also have to have, and it's promoted today, this what we talk about as ethical management. There is a slide we're going to get to here in a second, figure in your textbook. We have three types of managers. Well, the text does when it comes to ethical management, ethical decision making. You have the immoral manager, a amoral manager, and a moral manager. And I think that it's important to look at the three of these. A in front of a word is from the old Latin, means without or absence. The text says the amoral manager fails to consider ethics. I would tell you that in my parlance, the amoral manager simply doesn't have any. He's absent. There is none. Immoral manager doesn't consider the ethics of a decision, And whereas the moral manager takes the ethical decision making, puts ethical decision making into his or her own decision making. So puts the ethics in there. And we're going to talk about that when we get into chapter 9. The figure that I mentioned, figure 1.5, you can see on page 17 in the text. Learning, we know what learning is. We don't need to talk about that. The slide talks about an enduring change in behavior. Not so sure I ascribe to that. What I think is that you should be open to new ideas, to new concepts, and to move along with them. It was very difficult for me to learn things that I do today with technology. And by the way, I'm nowhere anywhere competent in a lot of what I do, and I continually forget things I'm supposed to do. But I've had to learn how to do this, and so I had to be open to that experience and to those experiences. And so, does it change my behavior? Yeah, I'm not sure that it does, but it does say that I'm willing to do something, and that's what we should all be. And we should be learning something new every day, whether it's something to do at work, whether it's something we do at home, whether it's something learning a new word or a new phrase or a new way to do something. Something we should all be open to. And of course, lifelong learning just means you're continuing this, and you realize that you do have a thing known as formal education, and your formal education, your formal learning, which we talk about going to college and earning a degree. That formal piece will stop at a certain period of time, usually by the time you have earned your degree. That does not mean to say that that field of study that you're in that you can't continue to learn things about. And we certainly hope that you do, and that you will, and your experience will broaden things. And so we're into this lifelong learning. I like to say, and I actually mean this, is that I learn from the students when we exchange in the forum section with our article analyses and case studies and the ethics and OB scenarios, because what I might say is how I might approach a topic or a subject is entirely different for students. And sometimes students have said things to me I hadn't even thought of before. And I think that's part of the learning process. And that's why the forum section, the forum posts that we go through are very important to all of us as a learning vehicle. And the final slide here on chapter 1, you can see on figure 1.6 on page 18 is experiential learning in an OB course. And it just simply talks about how you learn. And this is actually, as you look at this on page 18, and I hope that you do get a chance to look at this, this is kind of what we talk about as an adult learning theory. So we start out with initial experience, and then we move, and it talks about a whole bunch of things in there, which I'm not going to go through. You can read, and then you reflect upon that experience, and then you take that experience, that reflection, and then you move to theory building, and you get that from things that you go through, reading lectures, personal theories, etc. And then you move into experimentation. You try these new behaviors at work or in school or at home, etc. So this is experiential learning, sometimes known as adult learning. This is kind of like the Kolb model. Pardon me, David Kolb, who was an adult learning theorist. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 1. And I'm going to take a 5-minute break here to get a little drink of water and regenerate my throat. And we'll come back here at 5:22. And I hope you can stay with me. If you can't, if it's kind of bothersome that you can't see what I'm doing, etc., I understand that. Please remember that I will upload these tomorrow, and you'll be able to view them. They'll be embedded in week 1. So let's come back at 5:22. All right. It's 5:22. You still with me? Okay, I thought you might leave, and I understand that. Chapter 2, individual differences, values, and diversity, appreciating that people are different. Our study questions for this chapter are: what are individual differences and why are they important? What is personality? How are personality and stress related? What are individual values? And why is diversity important in the workplace? Well, to understand differences, we have to understand ourselves. And it talks about this in the slide. We have to know our likes and our dislikes. And then we have to understand the same things in other people. So notice that the slide talks about preferences and biases, et cetera, et cetera. We need to know where we are with these things. And then, pardon me, we need to understand what other people are with theirs. Without being able to know that, we talk at each other and not to each other. And I do not want to go into this too much, but I think we can all take a lesson from what we've seen that happened in Ferguson, Missouri in the last several weeks. I'm not here to cast judgment on anybody, but what I do know is that perceptions of police and policing activities and police forces are radically different in various communities in this country. And I am sure, without too much failure of contradiction, that the people who have negative feelings have good reasons for that. And so in many cases, instead of us talking about what our differences are and trying to understand those and trying to understand other people, we don't do that. We don't take the high road. We take the road that's most often traveled because it's comfortable for us. And we say those other people have to learn about us instead of us learning about them. It's very difficult. And if we look at our communities today, as more and more people move to areas that are, in some places, gated communities, or they don't interact with other people, the ability to understand the other person is diminished. And we're forced into this in the workplace, but of course there are ways that we can get around that and not interact and do the diversity we need to do, and or embrace the diversity and understand the diversity. So this business about differences, we have to know ourselves first, and then we have to know the other person as well, and we have to understand the other person. If we don't do that, we're going to have lots of problems. Now, components of self are self-concept, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. Now, I'm not going to talk about self-efficacy now because we get into self-efficacy later in the course, and there's a good bit of information on self-efficacy there. It's repeated. It's here. We're going to find it repeated, but it's built on a little later in the course, and I want to talk about it. And I have a particular thing reserved to talk about self-efficacy later. Simply meaning self-efficacy means our ability to see that a task that we're going to do, we can be successful at that task. And it's our belief that we'll be successful. Again, I'm going to expand on that later in the course. But self-concept is how we view how we view ourselves as we are, as physical beings, as social beings, spiritual, and hopefully as moral beings as well. Now, I want to differentiate here between spiritual and moral, and we're going to talk about this again later in the course. You can be spiritual and not be moral, and vice versa. Normally speaking, that doesn't happen, but that is a possibility. Self-esteem is just how we believe our self-worth. Do we believe that we are able to contribute? And do we believe the things that we do have value? And again, that comes from thinking about ourselves. This next slide talks about nature versus nurture. And we are probably made up 50% of each. Obviously, what we look like, our color of our hair, eyes, color of our skin, height, weight, and a few other things that are not visible, come from heredity, come from our parents, and from our parents' parents. And so we know those things, but our environment, where we grew up, our family surroundings, that's social, etc., that helps shape us as well. So we have some other, nature and nurture, they go together. And so you can't really separate one from the other. In this particular slide we're going to look at just shows the two diverging forces on the outside to the individual on the inside. Personality is our makeup. It is kind of who we are and what we are. It's what makes us us and no one else. That's our personality. It's unique, as the slide says, and each person is unique. I suppose you could say that there is some that doesn't go into that when we're talking about identical twins, but even then there is some difference. We have what is known as the Big Five personality dimensions, and they are extraversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Extroversion simply means outgoing, being able to meet people well and interact with people well. It also uses the term assertive, and we need to think of assertive here not as assertive in a bullish way, but just being assertive, saying things that need to be said and not holding them back. Agreeableness, I don't think we need to get into that. I think everybody understands that. Conscientiousness, that means being dependable, reliable. Emotional stability, that's very important. Not so much to keep your emotions in check, but to this talks about being secure in your person and not letting your emotions carry away. And an openness to experience, that's what we talked about before. We want to be open to experience. Everybody can't be what's known as an early adapter or adopter because we don't all fall in that same category. But we would prefer to be some person who is an adapter at a particular time rather than being a laggard. A laggard simply means we really don't want to be open to that experience. It's very difficult for us to do that. We're humans. We tend to be set in our ways. We like routine. We don't like to be pulled away from routine, and therefore that is an issue. So we need to think about those things. Social traits. This is how we appear to other people when we're interacting. Do we appear standoffish? Do we appear agreeable? Do we appear some other way? Are we a social being? Are we kind of a person who holds back and doesn't want to be committed, etc.? Oh. Information gathering, simply, we're going to get the information we need and we're going to turn it into something that's meaningful. And if you follow this next bullet down here, and then we're going to get into some things on Myers-Briggs type indicator, we can gather information all the way from being intuitive, which means we gather it from things that we have read, etc., and then internally digested it. Internally, I mean mentally, and then come up with some sort of an idea. Or we sensing. We get it from outside sources. Now, this is part of the Myers-Briggs that we're talking about here. This breaks down personality. You can see Myers-Briggs and the 4 problem-solving summaries found on page 31. Sensation, feeling, sensation, thinking, intuitive feeling, and then intuitive thinking. A lot of people take this test. It has a lot of validity to it. A number of companies use it, as is mentioned in the text. It's known as the MBTI Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And what this simply means is that this is how you approach things, problem-solving situations, and you're most comfortable doing that. It doesn't mean you'll always do it that way, but that's your most comfortable style. This particular slide talks about evaluation and problem solving. It really comes down to how we solve problems. This goes back to some of the Myers-Briggs. We do this intuitively, or do we take this from outside sources? So it's how we do this. Do we think through the process of problem solving, or do we do it on feeling? Now, when we get into the decision-making process, chapter 9, I believe, we talk about the classical decision-making process and behavioral decision-making process. And we'll be able to see that and be able to talk to that a little bit more of what we're doing right now. Now, this is the personal conception tendencies. And it's how we tend to think about our social and physical settings, as well as our beliefs. Now, when I use beliefs here, I'm talking about things that really make a difference to us. Slide talks about major. I don't want to use that term, what makes a difference to us. Then some things, how we're oriented to those things. In other words, when you hear a news story talks about something, how do you think about it? You think along a certain line, you think along some other line. It just depends on what you do. Locus of control. This simply means that we are able to control our life to the best of our ability. Now, we cannot, for the most part, control our surroundings. That's the environment in which we live. We can have some influence over that environment, but really can't control it for the most part. And what this simply means, this locus of control, is, do we feel that we're in control of our life, or are we at the mercy of outside influences? So you have an internal orientation. If you do, it means I'm in control. Or do you have an external orientation, which means, well, I really can't do much because I have all these forces out here impacting on me. So is one better than the other? No, I wouldn't say that, but you have to feel a certain way, and you have to act that way, and you have to act according with your feelings. And it's probably not a good idea to try to switch. A proactive personality, I don't think we need to talk too much about proactive personality. This is a person who does not follow. He or she is action-oriented. They wants to take the lead. Will continue doing until they get the results that they want. Notice down there it says till meaningful change occurs. I think we can say that. I said meaningful results, get what you want. I guess that's supposed to be meaningful change. At least it is to the person who wants that. And so that's what we're talking about, proactive personality. Person it's an action, and he or she wants to do things to not be controlled by the environment. I want to do the best that he or she can to control the environment. Now we're continuing here with personality, and we're going to talk about some ways that people, some personality traits. By the way, there is a much better figure in your text on page 32, ways in which those high in internal locus of control differ from those that are high in an external locus of control. don't know if you can say external locus of control, because if it's external, you probably don't have a lot of control over it. It's outside you. And so I'm not sure I agree with that term, but it gives you some idea. Figure 2.2 on page 32, the differences between people who have a high internal locus of control versus people who are influenced by externals. My term. We now move to some other types of personality, authoritarianism, and then dogmatism. And authoritarianism is just simply what it says. We tend to be, or those people who fall in that, tend to be in lockstep. The slide uses the term rigidity, and they don't deviate too much from conventional norms and values, and they tend to obey authority without question. Now, the term here says recognized authority. I didn't use that, but yeah, we could do it that way. But for the most part, we think of authority, we think it to be recognized, whether it's the boss in the workplace or somebody else. Dogmatism, as far as I'm concerned, follows that pretty much, because people who are dogmatic are also very rigid in what they do. These particular people see the world as fraught with danger, and they also follow authority without question. Then we get into people with, excuse me, I skipped here. I didn't mean to do that. And we get into people with this Machiavellian tendency. And the Machiavellians are devils, if you will. Notice at the beginning that it says that they tend to approach situations logically and thoughtfully, but they're capable of not telling the truth to get what they want. They are not swayed by things like loyalty and friendship, which means they would turn on those people immediately if they stood in the way of them getting what they wanted. And they are skilled in getting what they want. The reverse of that, person who's low on Machiavellian, they're going to accept direction from others. And what it says, they're loosely structured situations. And they're going to work hard to do well in highly structured situations. Now, I can tell you, I'm going to skip the next slide because it asks you take the test of whether you have these Machiavellian tendencies or not. There's a thing you can go to called Mac Test. I don't have any more than that, so I don't know how far that goes. I'm not taking the test. Now, one of the things you can do if you're interested in learning about Machiavelli is you can buy a book called The Prince, titled The Prince. It was written by Machiavelli. It's Machiavelli lived many years ago, many centuries ago, as a matter of fact. And so, but it's still around. The last time that I looked, you could probably find The Prince for around $5. It's a paperback book. Maybe some editions a little bit more expensive than that, but most of them are not. And you can learn a good deal by reading about Machiavelli. Now we're going to go from Machiavelli to self-monitoring. This is an ability to adjust your behavior as the situation dictates, and it also says that you're not going to go with the flow. Emotional adjustments. So this here, we're talking here about I want to read this to you because sometimes it's a little confusing. How much an individual experiences distress or displays unacceptable acts. And then it goes on to talk about the type A orientation, which is go, go, go orientation, or a type that's very competitive, high achievement oriented, or the type B, which is sort of laid back, easygoing, almost a complete reverse of the type A. We have to be careful about stress. And one of the reasons we have to be careful about stress is we don't always recognize stress. If you have had a major life event in the last 12 months, you've experienced stress whether you believed it or not. That could be a death of a parent or a loved one, could be the birth of a child, could be getting married, any number of other type things. Notice some of those things are happy events. Certainly birth of a child is one, certainly getting married is one, or at least it should be. But those are stressful. There's planning that goes into it and all sorts of things. And so we have to be careful about this. Stress comes out of demands on us. They're normally extraordinary demands or not normal demands. And the three type events that I talked about are not normal events. They're not normal, meaning every day. Yeah, they're normal events because they occur all the time. But it's not something that's routine, run of the mill. We do it every day. We don't have to stop and think about it. Everybody doesn't get married every day. Yeah, there are people that get married every day, but every person doesn't get married every day. Every person doesn't have a child born every day. So there's things we have to think about. And we have to be careful about stress because it can cause lots of problems. We have stressors at work. We have stressors at home. We have stressors all kinds of places. And so we need to see these things as they are and adjust to them as may be necessary. Pardon me. And then here's, work stressors, task demands, role ambiguities, conflicts, ethical dilemmas, etc. And some of it could be the environment in which we work in, not necessarily the best. Life stressors we talked about, family events, economic difficulties, which I did not talk about, which is certainly something to be concerned about, personal affairs. Now, stress does not have to be bad. This particular slide talks about the outcomes of stress, which can be good. And if we have what's known as moderate levels of stress, that's known as eustress, it can sometimes stimulate us to be, and we become more creative. We get more things done. But that's when that's kind of stress that you can handle. Maybe it's extra work or a new project or something like that, speaking of in the work setting. Whereas destructive stress or distress is never functional. It's not something we can handle. The term I use here is dysfunctional. It's negative. And so those are the things we have to be concerned about because that can impact on both the individual and his or her immediate work area. And then obviously it could extend depending upon the size of the organization all the way through the organization. You can cope with these by being problem focused, seeing the problem for what it is and addressing that and working out how to handle it. If you're emotion focused, you have to pull back, get control of your emotions so that they're not driving you, so that you're driving the emotions. This slide talks about things that can help you with stress. Pardon me. I have something in my throat. I can't get rid of it. And that first thing is personal wellness. We know if we feel better, if we're taking care of our well-being, if we're exercising on a routine basis, we're going to feel better. We're going to have a better frame of mind. We're going to be able to approach things better and differently. And so many organizations have wellness programs. I can only advise you if they have them in your organization, get in them and stay with them. What I want to tell you about employee assistance programs is this: know where they are, know who is in charge of them, and if you have an employee who is having problems, get that person to one of these professionals. Don't try to handle it yourself. Do be intelligent enough to recognize the problems, chronic tardiness, excessive absenteeism, withdrawal behaviors, etc. Notice those, but get the person to the right people. Don't try to handle it yourself. Values are, and we're going to talk about values again more as we get into the course in chapter 15. But these are what we prefer to do. It's how we intend to do things. This is our preferred way of operating, if you will. And our values influence what we do and how we behave. There are two sets of values: a terminal value, which is the end that we want to achieve, excuse me, and the instrumental values are our roadmap of how to get there. Maglino's categories of workplace values, and he's talking about people doing things: achievement, helping and concern for others, honesty, and fairness. There's very interesting workplace values. Value congruence occurs, and I guess the best way to say this is we like to be with others who are like us. Value congruence. Their values and my values are the same. They agree. Now let's look at your experience. Think of a job that you had in which you excelled and were most productive. Which of your individual values contributed to this? Something that you only you can answer for yourself. Culture is what we have, and we learn this from folks around us. It's the way we do things. It's the way we operate. Companies say this. They have a certain culture, and this is what we do. This is what sets us apart. And this talks about a particular society. Well, we can extend that to the workplace. Now, we have Hofstede's cultural values, and these are what he calls his dimensions of national culture. He says there are 5: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, and the long-term, short-term orientation. Power distance just means how we react or accept status and power of the folks over us. Uncertainty avoidance, it means, do we want structure or do we want unstructured? Individual collectivism, what do we prefer? I tell you what Americans prefer, they're individuals. And we find Australians are individuals. Actually, Australians, now I'm not talking about the original inhabitants of Australia, I'm talking about the settlers. They may be even more individual than we are, we Americans. If we talk about Japan, it's a collective. Masculinity, femininity, this is getting into stereotypes. And are those traits valued or not valued? And then long-term, short-term, we're a short-term society. We have a silver bullet mentality. We want the answer or the solution right now. We're going to move on to the next problem. The Japanese are long-term. Now you can see this, some of this power distance, high power distance, low power distance, pardon me, displayed in figure 2.4 at the bottom of page 41. And we're going to have a little bit of that right here on this particular slide, collectivism versus individualism, and then low power distance. Where we find it in the United States, low power distance individualism, where high power distance collectivism we find Japan, and individualism we'll find South Africa, France, etc. Workforce diversity. Again, we're going to talk about this. We talked about it a little bit before. It's what makes us different from other people. And in the workplace, it's what makes individuals different from the prevailing, now they say constituents here. I'm going to use the term culture. And the reason I'm using the term culture is because if the predominant workforce is made up of white people, then we will find other people on the outside away from that. So maybe constituency is a better word, etc. I want you to notice that I used the word white instead of Caucasian because Caucasian actually means people from the Caucasus region, which is in Russia or close to Russia. It was translated to people, white people, erroneously many years ago. So using the term Caucasian is probably not correct. We benefit from diversity because we have different perspectives on the same issue. And so we need to understand those varying thought processes and acknowledge them and celebrate them to the best of our ability. Now, we're going to talk about this when we get into a little bit more when we get into teams in Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. But we need to know that because when we get people from different perspectives, that can increase the strength of our organization if it is used properly. Now, if it's not used properly, it can be very destructive. And so now I'm not talking about channeling something. I'm talking about using it effectively and constructively. This is diversity in the workplace. We've talked about this. I'm not going to go through this laundry list. You know it as well as I do, and we don't need to dwell on that. Stereotyping is something that gets us in a lot of trouble. This is when we generalize. We single out an individual and see a certain trait that he or she possesses, and we generalize that to the entire population of those people. It usually is negative. So we have to be careful about stereotyping anybody or anything because it usually is proven to be wrong. Race and ethnicity, we need to know that discrimination against people based on race and ethnicity is prohibited by Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Sometimes I think we need to be reminded of that. And we probably be reminded of treating people equally based upon their skills, not based upon something else which is superficial. We need to think about women in the workplace. Women bring a different skill set than men do. They tend to be more democratic than men, and they tend to be good decision makers. Not to say men are not, but they tend to do things differently. They tend to be more collaborative than men are. It talks about the leaking pipeline. You'll talk about the leaking pipeline when you get into the case with Xerox. and it just means number of women decreasing, number of women in positions of authority decreasing as they ascend the hierarchy. Age is another one. We really have to be attentive to this. The workplace is becoming very diverse by age. It talks about baby boomers, Gen X's, and millennials, and we find a lot of the baby boomers are still staying in the workforce. Disability, we know what that is. That's something that an individual has that precludes him or her from effectively participating. Social identity theory helps us understand how we discriminate. I guess that's the best way to say that. And then if you place yourself in a certain social setting or a social group, this tends to lead to in-group identification, which tends to lead to discrimination. And then finally, this slide says organizations can create and support an environment of valuing differences through such things as you have to have a strong commitment from leadership, have opportunities to network, have role models, visibility through high-profile assignments, and then reducing subtleties that promote discrimination and stigma. That brings us to the end of chapter 2. We will now move on to chapter 3, and I want to take a short break, and we should be able to finish chapter 3 in about a half an hour. So let's take a break until 6:05. Hello? Okay, at 6:05, we're back. We're now going to wrap up week one with chapter 3, emotions, attitudes, and job satisfaction. Feelings deserve our attention. And we hope to answer these questions as we go through. What are emotions and moods? How do emotions and moods influence behavior? What are attitudes and how do they influence behavior? And then what is job satisfaction and why is it important? Emotions are strong feelings about someone. The slide says about someone or something. And I would tell you that you really shouldn't have strong emotions about something. Something tends to be an inanimate object, and your emotions about an inanimate object ought to be neutral. So we need to think about that. But emotions are strong feelings, either positive or negative. Fairly often they tend to be negative. Emotional intelligence is just the ability to understand our emotions, those of others, and then be able to use that information that we've gathered over a period of time to help us effectively manage relationships. Now, if we look at figure 3.1, let me get to the right page here, tell you what page that's on. On page 55, again, here we talk about things that we've already talked about before: self-awareness, social awareness, relationship management, which just means, as the slide says, building rapport between ourselves and someone else or someone else's, and then self-management. And notice the thing about self-management that says there: thinking before we act. The old saw about counting to 10. We should think about that. Self-conscious emotions, those are things that come to be from something internal. Feeling good about something, feeling not so good about something. Notice the shame, guilt, pride, etc. here. And then using these helps us regulate our relationships with others, hopefully on a positive basis. Social emotions arise from something outside us, external emotions, external sources, I mean to say. And we have to remember that external sources are things that we cannot control. So notice that here it talks about pity, envy, jealousy, etc. Now, some of that we just mentioned we can control. We can control jealousy. Very difficult, but we can control that. But that tends to come from something outside. And we see something and we react to something and not in the best way that we possibly can. Moods, generalized states of mind, either positive or negative. Now we're going to look at the difference between moods and emotions, and we can see this in figure 3.2 at the top of page 57. Now, if you notice here between the difference, emotions don't last as long as moods do. Talked about a student here. He was angry when the professor said his or her presentation wasn't very good. Notice what happens here. It's brief. It's an episode which doesn't last long, but it could turn into a mood. So we have to think about that. Mood, on the other hand, look at this, what starts out with: I don't have much energy today. I haven't felt very good all week. Notice that we have a difficulty identifying the source of the problem, and that what we have can be long lasting. people get into, I like to use the term funks, which is the mood, and we don't know how they get out of it. And this says it can be positive or negative. I think we think of moods often being negative, and notice it's mostly mental, and then it can influence our emotions. And these are some major emotions. Notice here, joy, anger, fear, love, kind of polar opposites of each other, if you will. Motion and mood contagion. Here we have a spillover effect, like water going over a dam or over a spillway. It affects emotions and moods, and we project our emotions and moods onto other people. Emotional labor needs to show certain emotions in order to perform a job well. So what this says is that if we have a negative emotion, then we're not going to perform well. An emotional dissonance is a disconnect. That's the best way to explain this. It's a disconnect between what we feel or what we believe, what we internalize, if you will, and what we try to show others, what we're trying to project. So we believe one way, we act another. That's a disconnect. Deep acting and surface acting. Deep acting, we try to modify our feelings to fit the situation. Surface acting, we try to hide our emotions and display different ones at the same time. So we're not being true to ourselves. Display rules just says the degree to which we can display these emotions and when it's appropriate to do that. Now the next slide talks about, and you can see this, by the way, displayed on page 60, figure 3.3. Show work environment, work events, personal predispositions, emotional reactions to job satisfaction, job performance. So this is a summary of effective events theory. And we're going to get to this in just a little bit more. So work environment, we think about characteristics of the job. We think about the emotional labor that we've talked about. And we think about demands of the job, etc. And those are things that will get to our emotions, be positive or negative, and then will either lead to high job satisfaction and high job performance. Don't think of these two here as being one high and the other one low. It's just the way they're shown here. And maybe job performance shouldn't be shown as a downer, although if your emotional reaction is on the negative side, it probably will be a downer. Attitudes just say this is the way we're programmed to act, either positively or negatively. And we have three things we think about here. We have a cognitive component. This is our beliefs. We have an affective component, which is predicated on the cognitive component. Affective is going to be something that we're going to do, positive or negative, and it stems from this cognitive. It's going to cause us to do something internally. We're going to feel a certain way. And then the behavior is what we're going to do. We're going to act in a certain way. Now let's take this to the slide here. You can see this in your text of figure 3.4 on page 61. Cognition, something we believe that's based upon, something that we believe it's based upon values, information, etc. And then we're going to create a positive or negative feeling. That's the affect. And in the behavior, we're going to do something. So what the example we have is my job, I don't have any responsibility, but I like to work. And so the effect here is because I have no responsibility, I really don't like doing what I'm doing. What's my behavior going to be? I'm going to look for other work, look for a new job, look for a new place. Now, chances are when I get that, when I make that decision, I'm not talking about finding a new job within the current organization. I'm most likely talking about leaving and going elsewhere. Cognitive dissonance is this. We talked about this before. Again, think of this as the disconnect. I think one way, I believe one way, but I act differently. It's just a disconnect. Now we can fix that. We can address that by changing the underlying attitude that caused this, by changing our behavior or our future behavior. Well, if this comes up, I'm not going to do it that way any longer. Or we can develop new ways of thinking about things and have new explanations. Or we can rationalize the inconsistency. Now, if you rationalize the inconsistency, you've not done anything. You still have cognitive dissonance. You just rationalize things. You're not making anything better. Job satisfaction just means how we feel about our jobs, either positive or negative. And of course, that includes the people we work with. And this could be in a team setting, or it could be in a department setting or something else if we're working as individuals. And it also has to do with the work environment, our surroundings. And we'll get to this a little bit next week when we bring up Fred Hertzberg's theory, his two-factor theory. And in job involvement just means how immersed, if you will, we are in what we do. Now, the slide uses the term dedicated, but I tell you, if you're immersed, you're going to be dedicated. You can't be immersed and not be dedicated. It doesn't happen. Now, this particular slide talks about organizational commitment, and it really, there's a few other things that it mentions here, and we're talking here about loyalty. How loyal am I to the company? We have rational commitment, emotional commitment, and an employee engagement. Rational commitment says, I'm committed to this job because it does things for me that I need for it to do. Helps pay my bills, helps give me some status, maybe helps me move up the ladder, etc. Emotional, how do I look at this job? Is it important? Does it have value? Is it a benefit to myself and to other people as well? And then engagement is either positive or negative. Am I engaged in my job or am I not engaged in my job? Am I connected to the organization or am I not connected to the organization? I tell you that you can't be committed. You cannot be committed to your job and not committed to the company and vice versa. Now, there is a possibility, a slight possibility, you could be committed to the organization and not like your job. That doesn't usually go, but it could be. But you can't not like your job and like the company at the same time. That's just not going to work. This is the Minnesota questionnaire about job satisfaction, and the job descriptive index talk about satisfaction on the job. And these are the facets, and we're going to talk again about this when we get to Fred Hertzberg next week. The work itself. Do I like the work? Do I enjoy this particular type of job? what kind of supervision do I get? Do I have responsibility? Is there some employee empowerment here? Do I get some authority? Am I allowed to do things, or somebody standing over my back all the time? Do I get along with my coworkers? Is it a good relationship, positive? Does it stimulate creative juices? Do I have opportunities for promotion? And is there a good reward system, which includes pay? We have to be careful about withdrawal behaviors. This probably goes back a little bit to the stress thing. People who don't like to come to work, or don't like to work, or don't like the organization tend to be tardy. They tend to be absent. They do have a greater propensity to leave. And if they don't, they're looking for greener pastures. If we have a lot of employee turnover, it is costly. We lose an experience, and then we have all this extra money that we have to put out to recruit a replacement. Organizational citizenship kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. This talks about a person who is committed to the organization and will go walk the extra mile to do the things that need to get done. Interpersonal organization citizenship behaviors have people doing the extra little things for others to help them do the things that they need. And organizational citizenship is something that is promoting the organization as a whole. I'm committed to the organization. I'm going to promote the organization. Organization does good things for me. I want to do good things for the organization. Now, this is a relationship between job satisfaction and job performance, and there are three theories here. Satisfaction causes performance, performance causes satisfaction, and then rewards, what you're being paid, etc., cause both satisfaction and performance. Now, in the theory that satisfaction causes performance, for a manager, he or she has to look at this as to make the employee happy on the job, because that's going to help increase their performance. Notice down here it says the job satisfaction is not a consistent predictor of work output. Now, I would like to take that a step further and say not only work output, that's quantity, but the quality of the work output. Now, performance causes satisfaction. Here for the manager, you want to create performance so it's high. Do something to help the person increase his or her performance so it will lead to greater satisfaction. And then, of course, high performance leads to greater rewards. Greater rewards lead to greater satisfaction. And then finally, it's down here at the bottom, it says performance leads to satisfaction only if the rewards are perceived as fair and equitable. And I think that's pretty much true, and that's part of what we'll talk about in equity theory when we get there. Pardon me. And here's a figure that we can see in the text, which does a very good job of pointing this out. Figure 3.5 at the bottom of page 68. Performance, valued rewards, satisfaction. Notice the demarcated there, the perceived value of the rewards. If the reward is not valued, now we're not necessarily talking about money, but if the reward is not valued, then you're probably not going to get satisfaction. So we look at valued rewards as an intervening variable and perceived equity of rewards as being a moderating variable. Now, rewards cause both satisfaction and performance. The last of the three theories. This is now here the manager has to focus on rewards, make sure that he or she selects the right ones. Of course, they're going to get those from the company, and making sure that they are passed out in the proper sequence so they're positively going to influence both satisfaction and job performance. Performance contingency it says the size of the reward varies in proportion to the level of performance. And finally, think about this. If you won the lottery, would you ever work again? What's this mean to you? We derive a lot from work. We have social identity. In some cases, we identify ourselves with work. A person identifies him or herself as a professor, for instance, or is a professor or designated a professor. When he or she is outside that university setting, they're no longer a professor. Now, sure, they may call themselves one, but in the workaday world outside that university setting, they're not a professor per se, because they're not doing their profession. Same way with an engineer or a physician or a lawyer or anybody else. So work in many cases identifies us. Where we identify with work, work lets us tell other people who we are. We get something from that. We get a status in some cases besides achievement and a few other things. So if you did win the lottery, how would you replace those? Well, the answer is you probably wouldn't. Now, you might be able to get a substitute or an alternative, which really wouldn't replace those particular things. Well, chapter 3 is always a short chapter. We finish this in about 20 some odd minutes here. And so next week, we're going to turn to chapter 4, Common Perceptual Distortions. And I have an article from the New York Times that I want to share with you about the perception. And then we'll get into the first of our two chapters, chapter 5, on motivation theories. I want to thank you for your attention tonight. I will try to get the technical issue of not being able to see the video worked out with our help desk people and find out what the issues are there. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Good night.